it's preparing. Live.
Participants. Oh, shoot. What's happened here? Oh, yeah. Panelists.
Hey, Daniel, it's Mark.
Hey, Mark, how are you?
Good. Waiting for you?
Oh. Wait, sorry. What do you mean today?
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah. Okay, we live.
I thought it was Thursday.
No.
What was this?
No. Okay.
Okay, I'll take.
Me too.
Welcome. I'm so sorry. We've had some interesting connection issues. But thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us this evening, this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you are. We get a very exciting program on today, and we're going to be talking about, well, what is we termed Trimtabs for preserving life on Earth. It's a very important conversation for many reasons, and you know what we'll be focusing on is the role of indigenous people in preserving biodiversity on Earth, and it's an important one to consider, and I'm going to tell you why in a few seconds. You know, in an ideal world, indigenous peoples would be living off their land according to their traditions and ways of life. But it's not an ideal world. And the struggles indigenous peoples have been facing for some 500 years is telling us a bleak story, not only for humanity, but for biosphere as well. And yet, every single scientific study points to indigenous peoples being the best guardians of our last remaining natural ecosystems, where 80% of land biodiversity is found. Every time an indigenous elder dies, we are losing a library, thousands of years of knowledge accumulated and transmitted. When we lose an indigenous tribe, we lose the only people who know the land they've lived on, the trees, the animals, the relationship between them. So I'm super happy, proud, excited to be joining by Kanyon and Wiki, and hopefully a couple of other speakers coming in out, hopefully. But the idea here is really to explore that relationship, explore what's at stake, and what kind of solutions we could be exploring not just by ourselves. I think the previous panel with Michelle and Miyoko was very telling in our needs to collaborate, to communicate, and be open to new worldviews. So from that, I pass it on to Wiki. Would you like to be next? Introduce yourself and why is such an important, from your own perspective, why it's such an important topic to be talking about. You need to unmute.
Oh, there we go. Kia ora no tātou. Mōna no mihi tōna ki ngā kōrero rangatira issues. So my name is Wiki Walker. I come from, I'm tangata whenua from Aotearoa, so I'm a person of the land from a place that most of you would know as New Zealand. And I come from a tribe called Ngāti Hine, which is, who has a chieftainess, which is slightly unusual in our country to have the feminine energy as our ancestry. So my mother, ngā parematau ngā momo kino, was my native mother, reared me in one of the last communities where we spoke our own language. And so I was brought up in the forest, in the wetlands, and with relationships to my whānau or family from the sea. So we call this relationship the land-sea relationship. My father comes from, so my memories and my upbringing have been steeped in my own language and in my own culture, which is kind of like biodiversity itself, weak and fragile. And so my father was European. He was from the British Isles, and he died when I was a child. So I have no memories of him. My only reminder of my father is the color of my skin and the color of my eyes and the color of my hair. Aside from that, I have no memories of my father. I sent a photo that as a part of my story, and I had two of my grandchildren with me. And I sent that photo as my visual response to the question that is being asked in this conference, in these sessions. So my grandchildren are my repository of our intergenerational transmission. And that's the beginning of and the end of my solution to biodiversity loss and climate change. If we don't have our language and customs and we are not intergenerationally transmitting them, regardless of what the environment may be around us, we continue as tangata whenua or people of the land to lose our culture and our knowledge. So intergenerational transmission, regardless of what surrounds us, we adapt, but we have remained who we are as tangata whenua, people of the land. And as I've said before, if we don't have that, then as biodiversity and climate change impact on us, we need they are our reciprocities, and they are they are me in the future. Just a wee bit more on that. And in our culture, we believe, as probably in many Indigenous peoples' beliefs, is that our language comes from the birds and the trees and the wind when we were in the time of oneness. and we've continued to sustain our language and our customs. Some of us have since the time beyond memories. So I just want to start by saying that it is for me and for my family and my tribe, the absolute importance of retaining our language and customs. As you may be aware, we come from a highly westernized country here in Aotearoa. Some by choice, some by being forced into it. So our story is one of being a highly westernized people. When we talk about the protection of biodiversity and even in our talks around climate change, so we are not only kaitiaki, we're not only caregivers, we're also kaingaki, which are cultivators. We live, to care for the land is to cultivate the land, and to cultivate the land, we need to care for the land. And those are sort of so we can provide for ourselves and our families. Yeah, so that's kind of my background. So I don't know how much more you want to hear from me. So I've grown up in the forest, in the native forest. I've seen the change. I've witnessed it. I'm a grandmother. I have 5 grandchildren. And as I've said, I've seen what the devastation in my own homelands of the loss of our forests to pasture lands. I have a sad story to tell, just as we all do, around the loss of our forests, to pasture land, to Pinus radiata forests, which are pine forests, the draining of our wetlands, which we once were so important for our hunting and gathering and what defined us as a people. So I've experienced all those through my life. And one of the things that through all of that from a very young age is actually the impact of westernization and Western economics on us as a people. And I can talk a wee bit more about my visit to Mexico in the beginning of this year, and have a wee bit more of a talk about that in a wider sense. I can only speak from my view. I'm not an international as of such person. My whole life has been about my own culture and about our language and customs and the environment of Aotearoa. And so if people are sort of aware of what's going on in our country, we've sort of went through a renaissance about 30 years ago, where people were wanting to find identity of themselves through language and custom, and of course by that is the connection and our inseparability with the natural world. So we've had a renaissance, and that's actually brought some amazing results in legislative change, and how our culture and knowledge is now valued in scientific spaces and stuff, as you've mentioned before. So that's kind of a wee bit of my background, and my involvement has taken me into places where I've to find the tools to try and continuously battle against these issues. And so as an Indigenous person in this country, I was the first one and only 35 years ago to write a submission about climate change and what it was going to do, the impact it would have, and have been fortunate enough to have participated in bringing in sort of like from a technical perspective, catalytic converters and whatnot. And so there's been, sort of always finding ways to deal with these things from as many angles as you can, because your heart is driven by your ancestors and about the care for our natural world and seeing what happens and witnessing these changes and these horrible, devastating changes that are happening to our land and to other people's lands. So at the minute, so I went and became educated. I have a background in various conservation and environmental roles as a senior advisor on planning and policy and strategy from a Māori perspective. at local, national, whānau families and tribal spaces. And am now actually about on the cusp of finishing my PhD, looking at literally on the cusp of it, of the relationships human beings have with the natural world, the influence of economics on those relationships, and the relationships. And I look at that through my own views and my own eyes as a tangata whenua, or person of the land. So that's me in a nutshell. And I'll probably leave it at that for now. So I'm Ina Sakayan, and I know there may be other people that like to introduce themselves. I've got so much to sort of talk about in terms of, you know, that second part of the question about defining the problem and what my views are and what's at stake. And so I'll just finish my introduction there, and we'll come back to those perhaps a wee bit after everyone said hello.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vicky. I pass the baton to Kanyon.
Mishmin Tuis, Conrakat Kanyon, CoyoteWoman, Sayers-Roods. I come from Indian Canyon Nation. Indian Canyon is the only federally recognized Indian country in central coastal California, along 300 coastal miles. That being said, in California, there are in excess of 250 language dialects. And in the Bay Area, there are 8. San Francisco Bay Area is known as Ohlone territory, and that even in itself is a misnomer. I identify as a proud Ohlone person. I am the founder of Indian Canyon TwoSpirit Society. I am the CEO and co-founder of Kanyon Konsulting, a consultation firm dedicated to bridging the gap between Indigenous and contemporary value systems. Having been born and raised on the land of my ancestors, I recognize that privilege. The privilege being that I was raised where my grandmother's 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 grandmothers have always been from. I recognize that privilege having been raised in a both traditional and intertribal environment where ceremony, culture, and dancing haven't stopped and are part of everyday life, where culture sharing opportunities are shared, and where Indigenous protocol is a practical approach and a methodology for our community to come together. Indigenous protocol is a respectful way for community members to interact. If you are not on the land of your ancestors, then you are a settler or a visitor or a traveler. And there's a lot of conversations between settlers, immigrants, colonizers. But if you're not on the homeland of your ancestors, then you're a visitor. And how are we good visitors? We have a practical protocol today. When we want to visit our neighbor and ask for a cup of sugar, we don't walk right into their kitchen and take it. We're not entitled to it. However, in the past, that is how people have operated. Because today we knock on doors as a simple gesture of seeking permission or gathering consent. And in the past, my ancestors, my community followed that practical protocol of seeking permission to be on the land or to travel through or to harvest and to be good visitors. And so honoring truth in history is a form of respecting the land, is a form of respecting the history of these spaces and places that we occupy, and is a practical approach because there has not been a reasonable amount of due diligence, especially in America, when it comes to honoring truth in history. When we don't honor truth in history, it replicates itself. And there are many times that oppressive tactics have been replicated over and over. Resource extraction from the environment, as well as Black and brown bodies. Entitlement and capitalism and colonial construct of affluence and complacency. Divorced approaches. People are Western settler colonizers, or the Western settler colonial mindset is divorced of accountability of how it needs to be responsible, accountable, and reciprocal to its impact of living systems. And so I honestly believe that we need more culture sharing opportunities. We need ways of honoring truth in history and considerations on how we could be good ancestors in training. because it's how we are in community together. And if we don't know about the past, if we don't know about the history, then we're coming to the table uninformed. And it ties into everything. And I recognize how lucky and privileged I am as a California native, and I'm taking steps to decolonize, and I am taking steps to re-indigenize my approach to the world and how I operate or how I walk in this world. I attempt to be a positive voice in reminding people that when we honor truth and history, we are taking steps to considering how our actions and words impact not only ourselves, but the next 7 generations in the future. And it's beautiful because when you're learning about history, I'm not just like, I hated history in English in class in school. I'm neurodivergent. I'm dyslexic. I have ADHD. I doodle. I'm a little crazy. And so I have a lot of struggles in that kind of classroom environment. But like being one to honor truth and history is beautiful. I love culture sharing opportunities. So when it comes to recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, when it comes to recognizing the rights of nature, everyone in every circle should take these considerations in being accountable, being appreciative, and recognizing how we are all meant to be stewards of the land. The animals and plants came first. They are the first people of the world. How are we in community with them? Are we walking around entitled and extracting resources from them? Are we singing to the plants? Are we thanking them when we pick them and harvest them? Are we considering how ethical and sustainable we are when we harvest? Are we wasting so many resources because we feel entitled to have the taste of something very, very far away? Are we considering how things get to us, how they've come to us, and how we benefit from them? What are we giving back? So I have a million ideas around all these constructs and topics. I just want to say that we can learn a lot from Indigenous peoples. We can learn a lot from history, and we should take those times to be accountable, reciprocal, think about sustainable methodologies of how we are practical in this world. So I'm glad to be here. So thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself and maybe put some context into what we'll be focusing on for the next 30 minutes?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep. Perfect.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Daniel, and I'm the U.S. Director at Survival International, which is the global movement for tribal peoples. And at Survival International, we've been working over the last 50 years in partnership with Indigenous and tribal peoples all around the world to help them protect their lives, to defend their lands, and to really just fundamentally determine their own futures. And it's just a real pleasure and honor to be here today with such amazing people on this panel. I'm really glad to be here. For a little bit of context on the question of the biodiversity crisis and how we move forward, I know as Mark has said, and I agree with the low-hanging fruit here is the recognition and protection of Indigenous rights to territory and of bringing Indigenous peoples from the periphery, or really they've been on the edge in many cases, into the center of conservation, environmentalism, and really efforts to address kind of the triple crises of social, economic, and environment that we're all facing. And there are some really, I think, stark reasons why this is really fundamental. Just first, 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity is located in Indigenous peoples' lands. And we've seen that it's really the Indigenous peoples on these lands that are often the best conservationists. And when we protect Indigenous peoples' lands rights, we see, for example, in the Amazon, it's very stark. You see much lower rates of deforestation. You see much smaller incidents of large-scale destructive fires every season, as we had last year, and maybe beginning this year as well. Also, Indigenous knowledge systems, as people have already talked about, are really fundamental to these questions. They developed in areas over hundreds of years, in many cases, or thousands, and are by large tied very much to the sustainable use of natural resources and the environment. And just as mean, one example, one reason there's so much biodiversity in these territories to conserve in the first place, right, is that they're being managed and have been managed over all these millennia by local peoples. So they really hold many important lessons about ecosystem management for the rest of the planet. And, you know, we've seen also that there at least as good of outcomes for conservation when Indigenous peoples are allowed and left to manage their own land. It's also very expensive, very inexpensive, way of getting at this biodiversity question. And it's probably one of the reasons that corporations don't like or prefer more large-scale technocratic type of solutions to environmental problems. It's much harder to make money off of. But I also want to bring up that it's also really, really important is in the context of the biodiversity crisis is also that because Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of fighting the oil, mining, logging, the expansion of agribusiness into their biodiverse areas. With one hotspot of many is Brazil, as many viewers are probably well aware, you know, who's actively working to open up indigenous land for commercial development. And these are often very deadly threats. There's a very high rate of death rate of environmental defenders from violence. Many of these are indigenous peoples, and particularly in Brazil again, this is both a land question, a life question, and a livelihood question. And kind of finally, I think it's very important, especially in forums like these that are focused on working on solutions to these global crises, that many of the so-called solutions to biodiversity that are offered up or to the climate crisis are also responsible for stealing land from and violating the rights of indigenous peoples. In particular, conservation projects, large scale, with very deep pockets, are often kicking indigenous peoples off their ancestral lands in the name of protecting nature. And ultimately, this rests on racist and colonial thinking that sees local peoples as threats to nature. They see them as unable to care for the environment properly. So we, quote unquote, need to go in as experts and do that. I think this is what relates to what Kanyon was calling the settler colonial mindset, right? Approach to a problem that sees these kind of different knowledge systems not as an asset, but as a problem. And it's completely backwards. You know, I think most of us agree humans are inseparable from nature, and relatedly that human diversity is critical for these biological questions, ecological biodiversity questions. So that these major conservation projects and other bioengineering projects that are a major threat to indigenous peoples, that's something that needs to be seriously grappled with by environmentalists and conservationists in particular, especially as calls to increase the percentage of the planet that's under protected areas increases, and more money will probably be going towards that. So that's a brief context to, I think what is really important, one aspect, one dimension of really thinking about these questions. We should be respecting land rights. We should be encouraging indigenous peoples and other local communities to remain on their lands if they so wish, to carry on managing their lands in their own ways, and just full stop above all, you know, stop the theft of territories for conservation. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to others, but I'm really looking forward to more conversation with everyone here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. I just want to share something quickly, which is the, I don't know if you, can you, hopefully it's not showing on, or maybe it is. Anyways, maybe there's a lapse between the live and what's being streamed, but this is just a summary of indigenous people in the world and in the context of biodiversity and living systems, because that's really what matters the most, and the transformation that where we're going from, which is a place where well, you know, individualism is what we do. We just take care of ourselves first, and then we look at what we might do elsewhere. Um, and this is very contrary to indigenous thinking, where you cannot live with a scorched land. You cannot live, you know, if you don't know the land. You cannot live if you're not in relationship with others to preserve that land. That land sustain everything and everyone. So, and thinking about it, you know, that's where we are. We are at this transition right now in between these two worlds. And I think that we have to be not only paying attention to what indigenous people do, but also how they are portrayed. You know, there is this dichotomy sometimes that you hear, which is very present, for instance, in Africa, where we can talk about poachers. And usually when we, you know, accuse somebody, and there was a story with the white giraffe being killed or dying a few months ago, and immediately the first people that were accused are poachers. But who are poachers, really? Think about it, and think about that thing where you find skeleton of a giraffe that had died 3 to 6 months ago in the wild, which probably nothing much remain to really get to the bottom of how this giraffe died. So you have a lot of push the narrative that tends to look at indigenous people as either backwards or unknowledgeable. And I'm so glad that you have two prime examples of amazing indigenous women right there on our panel. And the next side is exactly that. You know, what happened when indigenous people are pushed off the land. So very often it's, you know, government funded, like we can talk about guerrilla, and that's another really interesting ways of calling indigenous people, like rebels, guerrilla, which are most of the time just people defending their land. And you have the impact of civil society. Daniel was talking about conservation projects. That's typically where we'll be discussing about this false solution of setting aside 30% or 50% of Earth and being managed by whom? Always a big question. Extractive industries are really looking forward to putting their hand on indigenous land, because that's where most of the natural resources that will be needed to fuel our consumption and growth come from, right? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Wiki probably what is in your mind. You had last time we were talking, you said to me that you were completing your PhD, and that was part of, you know, one of the motivation that you had was to demonstrate how indigenous people, their traditional knowledge, are so essential into preserving biodiversity and land.
Come on.
Do you have?
Am I, oh, right. Am I still here?
You're still here.
Yay. Oh, I'm sorry about that. My connection, I keep losing you. Oh, here we go.
Okay, you're on.
Okay. So are you talking to me?
Yeah, we're waiting for you to.
So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was,
Um,
last time we spoke, you were finishing your PhD, and you had like a motivation for that. It was to, really literally demonstrate what uh, the indigenous knowledge was so important into preserving life or living systems, demonstrating the relationship between both. Well, maybe I think Wiki has some internet issues. Kenyon, would you like to jump in then?
Hi. With the context of like the work that I'm doing, or because it was, I know your phrasing was towards Wiki.
Well,
Your
yes, I
phrasing
mean
was, yeah.
for you and for Wiki as well, the place of indigenous knowledge, people, and that what kind of, if we define what the main issue is, there are many more that come out of this colonial mindset, is the treatment of indigenous people. And so, as I said, in introduction, in the ideal world, right, we would be letting indigenous people live their own way, and we wouldn't probably not be facing the environmental and all these different crises that we're facing. But it's not. For the last 500 years, we know what has been happening. So if we come from a place of collaboration, of understanding each other, what's the path forward? How can we just get together on that?
Well, we need to deconstruct and reconstruct. So we need to start strategizing. What does it mean to consider the rights of nature and the rights of Indigenous peoples? So that means bioregional education, truth and history, led by Indigenous peoples and BIPOC communities, because the disenfranchised communities that have not been a part of, well, a lot of the opportunities that many groups have solidified their structure of power, i.e. these oppressive tactics and the decision makers. We need to dismantle a lot of these oppressive systems. So, okay, from as simple as, well, like, I use an example. When we think about our water, we need to consider not only how we get water, but how everybody in our community is interacting with water. And so, from as simple as, let's say we have a new development around a road, and it needs to be a new riparian, a new greenscape. Instead of going shopping for the best price landscapers, we should already have a California native plant nursery, as well as a medicinal and uh, edible nursery of both foods and medicines and California native plants, given that I'm making this reference for California myself. Bioregional plants of that territory. And then the city has to empower the local community who's taking care of and tending that said nursery. So instead of having some landscape company who's like, oh, we're the best and you can shop with us and we do it really, really quick, we have educational systems like students, schools, and even retirement agencies where elders who aren't retiring, just sitting and letting their life go on, adventuring elders, investing their time in said nursery, where they're planting and tending these green lives, these green beings, these green relatives, our kinship to nature. So they're tending and taking care of this little nursery. The city has to utilize the resources of the territory, i.e. that bioregional greenscape, and these plants and medicines and foods are then installed or invested into that new riparian community. And those elders and community members who are invested in that nursery get to tend and take care of it wherever these plants go. So you then have an empowered community who's invested in in the living systems that they are taking care of and impacting. And then that area is benefiting from said medicines, plants, and opportunities. That's just like a little, like a dreamscape, a tiny little occurrence where it's like, okay, that means all of our systems need to connect. I look at schools as amazing powerhouses of innovation, and I cry every time I see kids. You have to complete this final project where you're going to use and waste resources. You're going to go shop for the newest plastic item. You're going to construct something because it meets the criterion of the assignment, so you could learn and present it in front of a classroom, which is good tools, good resources. But then at the end of it, they're like, "Yay, I got my A, B, or C." And then they throw it in the trash, or they keep it for a little while, hoarding materials. And what does it serve? What use is it? Look at this innovative power that these youngsters have, all the way from grade school all the way to university and college. Imagine some of those assignments if they were paralleled with a needs assessment with the community. The elder facility needs interaction, or public service of opportunities to interact with young ones. The young ones have to document a story of an elder. Like, boom, you have archiving history. You then teach them digital technology. You have a youngster and elder working with technology and mentorship programs in opportunity of storytelling and celebrating the oral narrative. I'm sitting here like, there's so many ideas of Indigenous peoples that, if applied in the modern construct, we can strategize sustainable futures. I'm just rambling off little ideas because when I try and zoom out to the big, there are many times community members will engage in a complacent attitude of, well, that's not the way it works. It's not possible because it was tried that way, or no, you can't do that because of this. And it's usually naysay, 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 naysay. And there are people who are scared to dream. They're scared to say, what does another way of being look like? What does restorative justice look like? What does accountable, reciprocal, sustainable, ethical harvesting methods look like? Sometimes it means saying no to the convenient, tasty morsels that come from across the world. Why are we harvesting items in one part of the world, packaging them in another part of the world because it's cheaper, and then transporting them to another part of the world? What is up with that? Why don't we allow small businesses to have their own little, like, slaughter industries and have their own bioregional food sources? Because we want to dismiss and we want to be big and industrial. This Western post-colonial industrial complex wants to provide to the nation, wants to provide food for these industrial slaughterhouses. Did you know that McDonald's sets a standard for fries, French fries? So the farmers who are trying to meet that criterion are changing an entire industry. And then if any of those spuds, any of them have spuds, any of those potatoes have spuds or damages, they're just being thrown away. Like, why don't we put rules on this to stop them? So I have a million ideas, and I have other relatives who talk just like me. We need to empower our community to share voice and perspective in these circles. Indigenous wisdoms around the world can yield amazing truths. Permaculture is actually indigenous wisdom. It's just repackaged by another colonizer who wants to sell and make a profit. And now it's disenfranchising brown people because the affluent community members who have resources and opportunities to take time off, have resources, backup money, an environment, are getting access to these permaculture classes, and yet again it's getting whitewashed. And it's like, breathe. We're replicating patterns because we don't know truth in history. Truth in history. I'm gonna keep going back to that no matter what. So that's my little rant on that topic.
No, yeah, and it's really important because we again, we tend to live in these bubbles and closed environment where we're not really seeing what is happening. And most often it's only because we don't want to. It's too uncomfortable, and there is, unfortunately, we lost Wiki to technical difficulties, but there is this other that Daniel was touching on earlier, which is really the big push of the moment. And the big push of the moment is to think that we need to set aside 30 to 50% of Earth and preserve it from human activities, which just like this sounds great, because we think of us, the dominant society and the damage we're doing, but we don't think about the people who have been actually living on this land for thousands of years, right? So Danielle, can you talk a little bit about this? Because that's something that Survival International has been such a powerful transmission of indigenous voices in both in Africa, Asia, and America. And I'm completely a big fan of Survival International. I love what you do, especially how you do it. So there is, I guess there is two questions in that. Is talking about these new concepts, or they're not new actually. They kind of, they've been around for quite some time, but they're really being pushed at that very moment. And the second is also that very special relationship that Survival International has been able to establish with Indigenous people.
Sure. Well, thanks for your kind words, Mark, about our work. I do appreciate it. Sure. We've at Survival have been working on this issue for since decades now. So against sort of the abuses of conservation and protected areas against indigenous and tribal peoples in the name of nature. So this problem is really, nothing new, and it goes all the way back to the roots of how people in the West conceptualize and think about nature and wilderness, and all the major figures from Europe and the United States, the old white men who, are the fathers, quote unquote, of environmentalism and of conservation. Which has really seen nature as something separate from humans, and that to protect it, we need to exclude all humans from that. And there's a very long history here. You'd think that we'd gotten better at it, but unfortunately, I don't think that we have. When I say we, I mean sort of the big conservation organizations like the WWF and others, what they've gotten good at is paying very nice lip service to the idea of working with indigenous peoples, to the idea of participation, to the idea of inclusion. But from what we've seen, these have been really written down on paper and then pretty much not employed at all. They continue to be focused on protecting land from the people that are using that. There's plenty of examples of this, and I'll just also talk or bring up very quickly another sad story that relates to this, and something that you mentioned, Mark, about who are the poachers, right? When we hear about poaching and how we need to arm and support and train rangers to protect these protected areas. Just a few days ago, a young man was killed in Chitwan National Park in Nepal. And our sources tell us he was gathering snails, right, for his family to eat, and was killed by rangers. And then if that was reported in the media, if it was reported at all, that would be probably classified as a poacher. And so that narrative of poacher and protection and militarization of these areas and of keeping the bad people out, right? The local indigenous people has really very, very serious consequences, not just for individuals getting shot, but for entire cultures. Another really stark case is in the Congo Basin in Africa, where the WF, with money from the United States government, from the European Commission, and many other sources, has been trying to set up a protected area in rainforest used by many traditional people that are often pejoratively called pygmies, but there are many, many peoples there that could be considered forest peoples, indigenous peoples, tribal peoples, who've been now excluded from their ancestral lands via violence and can't go into the forest anymore to gather medicinal herbs, to hunt for food, to gather for food, to visit sacred sites. And really, you know, that's an entire peoples that's at risk of losing their entire identity and culture. As many, without access to land, you lose your ability to reproduce your community and culture in many cases. And conservationists like to say, oh, well, we can have them work in the tourist industry. That's much more sustainable, but really you're seeing entire impoverishment of peoples. And so the idea that, you know, to save nature, we need to double those areas under control up to 30% is an extremely dangerous idea. And so without real, you know, free, prior informed consent, participation of indigenous peoples, but in really meaningful ways, not in token ways, the human rights abuses, the land theft will only accelerate. And so this is a huge problem. And Mark also kind of alluded to just sort of how difficult this idea can be to kind of communicate to people when we in you know, the global north, we hear of protected areas, we hear of conservation, and it's something that's sounds great, sounds popular, and sounds something that we should all be behind. But you don't have to kind of pull the curtain back very far to see the real problems with that. Was there a comment? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Wiki. Hi, you're back.
Yay, hello. Sorry about that. I don't know what's happening with my connection. Where I live is very remote, up on a hill.
So thank you so much, Danielle. I know we don't have much more time, but Wiki, if you could talk a little bit about, again, you know, the work that you're doing, and especially why you went into, even, you know, I mean, a PhD is not a small thing. I'm blessed actually to be surrounded by 2 PhDs here, and one sister was just like me, was not functioning well in that space of learning by Western standards. But what can you share a little bit about that work that really you feel like is in service of your community?
Okay, I'll make it quick just in case I go off again. So what I'm doing, so my PhD is what's called an autoethnographic study. So I'm studying myself because there's not very many of us tangata whenua left here who grew up the way I did. So, and I understand all of these struggles that I hear from a global level right down through to community levels. And so what my PhD is doing is I am coming from another perspective where I'm taking our knowing and our knowledge. And so to be I'll cut to the chase, I've designed a new economic model. And it's one, because everything we talk about, it's all about what economics, it's all from an economic, that's the elephant, well, it's not the elephant in the room. That is at the heart of the majority of all of these, what happens to us as tangata whenua, or indigenous peoples. So what I've done is I've taken a view of our own indigenous view. I don't care about the Western view anymore. I know it very well. So I've taken our own indigenous view here, my view as a tangata whenua, and taken the very nature of existence as we understand it, not the mechanistic philosophy that comes from the West, but our own ontology, the nature of existence. What is our nature of existence? So I've taken that, and from that philosophical foundation, I've gone, and it's drawn from the natural world. And we have what we call Te Mano Te Aotearoa, which is the power of the natural world, which is about environmental sovereignty. So we're subjects to it. And all of us, we can talk about that on its own, but we're subjects to environmental sovereignty. Well, for our people, we are. And so I've taken that philosophical foundation and then I've built an economic, what I call koru economies, which is spiraling. It's a spiral. We believe in a pattern in nature called the koru, and Mark has that in his picture, which is the spiral. So we don't see things in circles and stuff. So our people see things in spirals and in threes. So I've taken that pattern, and I've taken it from what I've learned and seen in the native forests of my home and how it grows from what's a fern. Now the fern is one of the oldest and most ancient plants on the planet, and it is like scientifically proven that it's over 350 million years old, and yet it has survived, and it's resilient, and it's still here, and it adapts to just so many different spaces. And so and so my understanding, so I've based this what I call koru economies on what I see. I've taken it from nature. And so when I look at all these other, and so I build on that, and I come up with what are the key things that I see from this that inform me, and it's all taken from an Indigenous perspective. So like, if you have, I went to Mexico and I went to a workshop there, fantastic, in La Cristobal, which is on the southern part of Mexico. And I went to a feminine boot camp for 10 days. It was to do with what's called decoloniality economies, diverse economies, and solidarity economics. And I was absolutely, green economics is absolutely fantastic, because these are movements from people like from in the South America, who are pushing back, and Mexico, at the disruption of capitalism and what it does with all these things, like what Daniel talked about. And so what it is their response. And so decoloniality economics was actually constructed by South American academics, and it was fantastic. And, you know, to start for people who have no access to money and things, and to deal with what you were talking about, Daniel, about green economies, what it does. It comes in and it's, for example, the conservation lands and whatnot there. So I went there and looked at that as different models. I've been heavily involved with different things like permaculture, circular economy, which is all trending at the moment, and the natural step, which comes from Sweden, studied that in Sweden itself, which looked at sustainable development and stuff. So all of these things, in whatever part of the world we go to, the common factor is that it comes from Western economic domination. And I believe, if you talk about us as Indigenous leaders, and for me, the leadership is in actually shifting the paradigm of economics. The hardest part, go straight to the heart of the matter. You know, we can do all this stuff on top, but the real place that I'm interested in giving it a go, is to go straight to the heart, and that's to challenge economic and to shift that paradigm. And so that's what my PhD is doing. It's no easy task. It's really challenging. However, equally, as a result of that, where I am now, as a woman, as an Indigenous woman, as I feel like it's been really kind of self-empowering, because sometimes we don't believe, I don't know if we believe that we can actually challenge the actual economic model itself. And when we really unpack what that model is and what it's done to us, you know, it comes from a mechanistic philosophy of that everything can be, even you and I, humans, nature, can be pulled apart, reduced to something, to bits, and then we can rebuild it. And so if you think of that, that's one part of the history and the story. When you talk about histories, we call that whakapapa. So when you look at the history of that stuff, and I've just noted with interest that one of the three dominant in recent times from the 17th century forward, who have been responsible for this, were all men, but they had no children. So that's why I put my grandchildren in my photo when I submitted my my piece about who I am. So the founders of this thing that dominates us were men with no children. And so for me, I actually was, I'm also inspired by another American Indian woman who wrote, her name is Audrey Launders, and she does a blog on Indigenous womanhood. And she talks about like no longer being in a place where, you know, we spend our energy on kind of like battling the colonizer. Colonization is colonization. It ain't going nowhere, and it is what it is. So the resistance and strength of Indigenousness is in our own Indigenous systems. And as an Indigenous woman, for me, at the center of it is the feminine energy. So with what we have when we talk about climate change and biodiversity is, well, for me, it's, you know, I'm really doing this quickly because I'm probably going to cut out again. Is the feminine energy is one. It is central to anything that we that because of what it is, and what it is who we are. And men have feminine energy too. It's not only the women. We are the caretakers of feminine energy because we make babies, and our role in that energy. Men also have feminine energy. They've just allowed themselves somehow to be dominated by that other part of them that seems to think that it has power control. And this is what economics has done. It's actually, and that's for our men, you know, that's what a lot of our men kind of chose to go their way, because it actually disrupted the energies that we have as women and men. And that feminine energy that flows within all of us. And that's something we don't talk about. We seem to separate by gender and say, I'm over here, you're over there. Feminine energy is in all of us because that's what comes from nature. So we believe that here, we see that mana, so this power, you know, it comes from the natural world. We are here by virtue of we exist because the natural world gives us the gift of life. It gives us a gift, and we don't treat it like a gift anymore. And I think that's the common bond that I would have, even with me in my little corner here in the world, with all other Indigenous people. We believe that it's a gift. It's not a privilege. It's a gift to us. The natural world has given it to us. We also believe in, a thing we believe in is that mana, or this energy, will not extinguish. It will not die. We'll die before it dies. We believe that we will go to it will go away, it will return to the sacred place. It will return. It will wait until you know, until we want to once again have a oneness with it. Our role here is to our whānau, because we also believe that the natural world, you know, on the hierarchy, if you want to talk about the animal kingdom, we're actually lower down the chain. An insect is actually higher up the chain than what I am. A fish is actually higher up the chain than what I am. So I have a responsibility to my whānau. You know, I have a responsibility to my whānau. For the people like with this, you know, with Daniel was talking about, you know, about those scenarios, you know, well, I can only talk with what I've, my own wee little taste and experience in Mexico at the beginning of this year, and the Zapista movement, autonomy, and what they've done to try, you know, that they now have a significant control, and they have nothing. They just do what they do. They've just said, nah. And so they've an autonomous movement, you know, fantastic, you know, and in that autonomy, those Indigenous peoples in those lands are getting some form of solidarity, you know, in those forests, and like against that, what is it, that that REDD, that red or whatever, you know, that with the carbon credits and whatnot. For our brothers and sisters in America, you know, it's with people like what Kanyon's doing, you know, it's all of these things collectively bringing them together to make a sort of solid solidarity. And we challenge economics. We don't have to move about on the top. We as Indigenous people, we can go straight to the heart of the matter, because I would suggest make an assumption that all of us have something in common with the power of the natural world, that what it is, what that is, and that it's a gift, and it's not our privilege and our right to constantly, because my grandchildren, I'll come back to my grandchildren, you know, unfortunately, this is what my grandchildren are inheriting. I have to fight every day as an Indigenous woman to educate my grandchildren, to give them a space to actually connect with the natural world, where once that was so natural, it just happened, and now it's not happening. There's another thing that was interesting. I sent an article about a philosophy called rewilding.
Yeah,
and rewilding, if
I'm so sorry, but
so I'll just, yeah, okay, Mark, so I'll finish off here, because
I could hear you like, you know,
yeah,
for
no, I'm
hours.
just conscious that I'm just trying to get it all out there before I close down again. I was hoping I could do it in bits.
We're just running out of time, but we'll go.
Yeah.
We'll pass the time. Don't worry.
Okay, so I'll just, and I think I've covered it all. I think I've actually got it all. And that's really what I'm doing with my PhD, with what I'm doing with my work here. And thank you for giving me that space to say that, because I was hoping I could sort of talk with everybody, you know, as a panel does in bits. So thanks for that. My connection's not very good here, and I hope that that what I have contributed is something of value.
No, oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm, you know, from what I was listening to the three of you, because I'm always thinking, like, you know, how do we move into a collaboration space? And what you've offered, the three of you, is just that, is, you know, like rethinking systems, education, reminding the world that, you know, it's, we need to take that into consideration, the fact that if, you know, all this land, all this biodiversity is here for a reason, and that Indigenous people have been the grandmasters of balancing that, of keeping that biodiversity alive and thriving. There is no places on earth that has not been shaped by humans, but there's been like this fork at one point in history where we were stewards, and then we became extractor. And as we became extractor, we become destructor. So there is this reckoning of these two branches of human civilization or human development. And I'm so glad that to have you here, because, as I said, you know, we need to move into that space of collaboration. So, you know, if you don't see, if you hear about a project or a policy, a strategy that excluded Indigenous people, then we are in the wrong. And if it is inclusive of Indigenous people, then, you know, we get a better chance. We get a better chance. And I think that's the work that we all need to do, is to be inclusive, and always thinking in terms of, you know, collaboration, and it's not on the dominant society's terms, but it is on Indigenous people's terms, especially when it comes to their land. And I'm just going to give you all like a 1 or 2 minutes to close. Kanyon, if you want to start.
Well, we're, as you can tell, Indigenous community members like to be in community and in conversation. So when we think about business as usual, we have to think about what are the things and the conversations that haven't been brought into consideration. When we have these meetings, when we have these gatherings, if you ever look up the Thanksgiving address by the Haudenosaunee community, imagine if every gathering at the United Nations and every gathering at a government institution, when they're going to make a decision that impacts the people, that they have to recite a Thanksgiving address, and it gives thanks to all living beings and living systems. And it actually kind of grounds you, because like when you're in the hustle bustle of the world and then you get a chance to recite something that expresses gratitude of appreciation and how the interconnectivity of everything is present, you ground yourself, and then you start to recognize, wow, I am in a position of a decision and it's going to impact more than my life. I should probably make that understanding. I take the time to consider, what does it mean to understand that? Imagine the shift that could occur from one simple gesture of expressing a line of gratitude. But imagine all of the next generations, if we had a chance to implement opportunities of culture sharing in schools and other spaces. Imagine where that shift that can transpire. And so imagine Indigenous futurisms. Let's rematriate the land. Let's be good stewards of the land. And let's consider how our actions and words impact the next 7 generations. So thank you.
Thank you. Vicky, you have 1-2 minutes to conclude. You muted.
Yeah. So exactly, I support exactly what Kanyon was saying. Further to that is that if we want to talk about shifting paradigms and to achieve those, what we say we want to achieve with Indigenous leadership, is that part of that solidarity is we need to challenge the Western economic system and what its foundations, its philosophy, and it's outdated, and our systems of belief as Indigenous people are timeless, and we know how to adapt. We wouldn't be here if we didn't. And so I just think that if we could, with some of these solidarities and working together to shift and change and bring people into our model, it's like what you said, Mark, it's inclusiveness, but it's inclusiveness into our world, not the other way around. I no longer see cross-cultural solutions as the solution. Why does it have to be we go into that world to find the solution? Welcome to mine. And that's all I have to say. And thank you for the invitation and to talk.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Danielle?
This has been great. Thank you to everyone so much. So much to say and talk about, but I guess we have to keep it as short as possible. I just want to say that idea of inclusiveness, Wiki, that you mentioned, I think is a really important point about who's going to whose kind of paradigm, right? So I think that's really critical, important when we think about what autonomy, what self-determination, what sovereignty, and what participation looks like, right? And I think it's really critical that Indigenous peoples, continue to come closer to the center of environmentalism, of climate change policy, of conservation policy, right? As really central actors, not as people brought into, and as we know, a really completely malfunctioning, messed up system. So that's really important. I think also people have talked about a mind shift change. That's something that we at Survival always try to keep at the center of our work, thinking about how we can contribute to a broader change of thinking around Indigenous and tribal peoples as contemporary peoples, as people that are constantly evolving and not kind of stuck in time or backwards or Stone Age or a lot of these negative kind of stereotypes that still are really very dominant currents of how people think about these in Western society many times. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm really glad to meet everyone as a part of it, and I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much to the three of you. It was a true honor and blessings to have you. And yeah, and we need to have a much bigger conversation. Every time I'm having these conversations, and I just feel like, gosh, we just peel one layer. We just open like a little box, and then there's all these things that's coming out, and we just gave a snapshot of what could be an amazing week just talking about nature and Indigenous contribution to preserving that fabric. So thank you so much, really. Thank you for joining us, and yeah, we'll do that again. Thank you.
Yummy.
Great.
Ata.
Goodbye, everyone.